Okay, I'm going to start right on the dot because I really don't want to make the mistake of not having enough time for the discussion at the end. So that's my big aim. So I've got Sandra's going to help me out as well. Tell me if I'm going on with myself. So, come in. So, yeah. Hello everyone. So my name is Will Harden. I work at the University of Liverpool. I'm also in the EAP for Social Justice SIG. And my talk today is called "Can We Talk About Racism?" An exploration of EAP practitioners' views on implementing critical social justice texts on the EAP curricula. So initially, when I first submitted my proposal, actually, this bit wasn't included. It was just this second bit, and I was just going to focus it on this kind of broader discussion about, specifically, it's about the topics of text on the EAP curricula. But actually, when I resubmitted my proposal, I decided actually I wanted to include this specifically. Can we talk about racism? Because the example that I'm going to show you is related to racism anyway. So I think from work, like my short experience of working in this topic area, I've realised that it's good to prepare people if they're going to talk about racism, because not everybody wants to talk about it for different reasons. And I also think that, well, I looked through the list of all the other talks on this, and obviously it's deconstructing EAP, and there wasn't any talk that talked explicitly about racism. Racism's come up a little bit, maybe in some of the discussions, in some of the talks, decolonisation, those kind of things, but nothing about racism, so I thought it was important that it was included on the session, especially if you look around at the conference as well. I've noticed there's a lot of white people in this conference, and there's a lot of white people in EAP, and I think that we, like, as white people, we have a responsibility to talk about racism. I think that's important. That's just my opinion. Okay. Okay. We got that bit out of the way. Okay. So right. Okay. So yeah. Now I'm going to talk about the broader issue firstly. Yeah, I'm going to go onto this broader issue of, because I think what I'm talking about is text selection and social justice, critical social justice text in EAP, and I think this is connected to the EAP apolitical debate, which has come up loads in this conference already. This is some of the literature that I was able to identify. I'm not going to go into this, but if you want to check it out, this kind of covers this debate about, should EAP be political or not. I'm sure there's way more than that as well. But basically, I'm going to try and summarise it. It's a very basic summary. But critical EAP constructs itself as challenging power. They advocate for using socio-political topics in classes. They're quite explicit about doing that. They're connected to students' lives. They acknowledge the fact that education is political, and not just acknowledge it, but they kind of actually advocate that education should be political as well as a political act. Whereas more accommodationist views of EAP often have a kind of discourse of pragmatism around student needs in terms of it, like critical EAP would also argue that they deal with students' needs as well. So I'm not trying to create a bind here, even though I put verses in the middle. What they say is that student needs should be basically what their kind of immediate context is, their language requirements on their disciplines, and it's like often this aligns with the institutional needs. The concept of carrier content is a big thing. So the idea that texts are really just a form of delivery to kind of get onto the more important task of language learning, and or maybe it could be rhetorical moves as well. It doesn't have to be just language learning, and they construct this view as being apolitical, neutral, impartial, even though that in itself is a kind of political stance. It's not really neutral, because even deciding all of this is a stance, as I've illustrated there. Okay, so here I've said, is the debate over? Because my reviewer, and actually, both my reviewers were really helpful, but one of the reviewers said, well, actually, maybe that's not so interesting anymore. This debate's over. Yeah, we've already decided that EAP. What the real debate is actually now is that universities are kind of co-opting this the kind of discourse of social justice, and neoliberal universities are co-opting it. They're co-opting EDI, and so actually the real question is actually which topics are marginalised and which are not. And I kind of agree with them. You know, I do think that is maybe the real debate. Having said that, I don't think the debate's over, so I disagree with them on that. I think the debate is very much alive. Maybe they were talking about in the literature, I don't know, but certainly in practice on the ground, I don't think it's over. As we saw in a recent BALEAP thread, which was very useful for me. I was like, yes, like, this really supports my argument. Yeah, here you can see it's kind of constructing a position of neutrality. It says, as legitimate a point of view to oppose strikes as to support them. Some people were annoyed that they kind of framed the question in that way. I don't have a problem personally with that question. I think it's good to kind of provoke. But there was only one-sided text and not the other. Maybe we should have had more different text. Check that debate out. It's interesting. But also here there was a recent blog by Olwen Alexander, who's quite well known, quite influential in EAP, and she wrote a blog about carrier content, and she wasn't arguing against carrier content. She was saying teachers misunderstand it. It's all about a vehicle for language learning, but really it should be about rhetorical moves, genre. That's what carrier content should be. But she was really saying that she was criticising teachers for selecting text on the basis of topic. Yeah, they shouldn't select text on the basis of topic, because what they do is they reflect their own arts and humanities background and their left liberal ideology. This is what she said. It's very recent, it's very influential. So the debate, in my opinion, is not over anyway. Yeah. Okay, so now we get into like the actual topic of what the example I want to present you really, which is this. So this was, this is the question for my talk. And this was a talk that I actually introduced onto a pre-sessional course, a summer pre-sessional course. It was by JP Gerald and Justin, and he very kindly gave me permission to use this talk in this session. So really grateful for him letting me do that. And he actually did this talk especially for our pre-sessional as well. Yeah. So what I would like you to do, I want to show you this talk today. Yeah, so it's going to be like a screening. We're going to have a screening of the talk. And then we're going to reflect and discuss on the talk specifically. And then hopefully if there's time, we'll go a bit broader. Hopefully you'll have the time to share your own experiences maybe of implementing social justice texts. Okay, here I've kind of given you an imaginary teaching context. This was my teaching context. But I just thought, actually, maybe you can just think about your own teaching context. You don't have to, but this was the teaching context where I introduced it. So I introduced it on a summer pre-sessional. It was part of a lecture series on 8 different topics. It wasn't the only topic. Students also get pre-reading texts about the topic. They have, basically their assessment task is each week they have to conduct a small group seminar. Like there's 4 of them, student to student. They record that seminar. And in that seminar, they have to build a shared critical understanding of the lecture each week. That's how they get assessed on the course. Yeah. Okay. So with that context, or you can think about your own context, we're going to watch the talk. Okay. So I can relax.
Okay. So my name is JBB Gerald. I've been asked to give you all a little bit of talk for what he's calling an emancipatory lecture series. So I sort of decided to bring out a topic from a book that I'm working on. The title of the chapter is Bad at English, and it's about the white listener and the student skills perception, and how, well, the unnamed white listener affects the way you all see yourselves. So I say you, when I say you in this presentation, I'm referring to students. If you're not a student, well, okay then, I'm not talking to you. But otherwise, you should enjoy it. Let's go. All right, so at a previous position, I was the manager for an adult education program at a nonprofit or a not-for-profit, which offered, among other things, free English classes. So our students came from many places, but most of them were from Latin America or East Asia. Now, among the former group was one woman who, when I asked, as I did of everybody, what interested her in the classes, told me she had come to hit what she called professional ceiling. right? Because of the way her speech was perceived. Now, she was seen as foreign regardless of what she said, even though she was actually an American. She's from Puerto Rico. And along similar lines, some of my Japanese students later on told me that these were highly educated women, by the way, who they were unable to work, and they came to our classes because they wanted to improve their English. But it became clear to me very quickly that even by the constructed standards of dominant American English, there was nothing wrong with their writing or speaking. Sure, an error here or there, but anyone who wanted to understand what they were saying could have done so without too much effort. Even people who weren't language teachers like me. I kept hearing a refrain from all these students that they were bad at English. And I thought, and though I regretfully never had the wherewithal to ask them who had told them that that was true, it had some mystical level of improvement to which I was supposed to elevate them. I knew I was working against something other than grammar rules. See, I put these things in here. They did become more comfortable in my classroom, so they seemed to quote unquote improve. And that made me believe that the issue was their confidence, because I didn't really know what they were up against. And I didn't understand at the time how they would always be perceived as deficient in their use of English. I was right to notice that the issue wasn't their ability or their intelligence, but believing the issue was confidence is still an example of a deficit mindset. Believing there's a problem with the students, and it doesn't really speak to the greater forces at play that were responsible for this supposed lack of courage. Unfortunately, like many language teachers, I hadn't consumed any of the scholarship that affects my work now, and I was still searching for some sort of silver bullet that would fix my students. I knew intuitively that there was something wrong with the system that would lead my students to internalize these deficiencies. But I still thought of language in this detached, disembodied way, not yet able to fully consider how their identities played a central role in the fact that they believed that their English, which was exemplary even by oppressive standards, was in fact bad. Only later would I come to understand the powerful ideologies at play, and indeed part of the reason I've done this work and I'm presenting this to you is that I can't go back and tell them where the problems really were. I can't go back in time. But I can tell you. So, racial linguistic ideologies. Hopefully you've heard of these. If you haven't, you're going to hear about them now. I think any language training program, whether you are a student or a teacher, right, needs to be intimately familiar with the concept of racial linguistic ideologies. My own master's program when I was a student didn't do this because I graduated before these ideas came out. So, bad luck for me. But if you're reading this now, or you're listening to this now, and you have any influence on language teachers, as a student, you can tell your teachers, or if you're a teacher, you can tell other language teachers. You have no excuse. This is something you need to learn about as a language teacher. So, racial linguistic ideologies produce racialized speaking subjects who are constructed as linguistically deviant, even when engaging in linguistic practices positioned as normative or innovative when produced by privileged white subjects. Basically, you can say something exactly the same way as a white speaker, but because you are racialized, you will be seen as deficient, as lacking. Your English will be seen as bad because of who you are, no matter if you sound the same way or use the right grammar. That's the idea, okay? So standardized English, therefore, becomes associated with white bodies. And this process is called racial linguistic enregisterment, right? The racial linguistic ideologies become associated with certain bodies. And what that means is if you're outside of those bodies, if you have a different body, a different identity, then your English is not seen as equivalent to standardized English, even if you use the same words, the same grammar, whatever. So why is this the case? Aside from, we know it's racism, but aside from that, right, what is happening? So basically, there's this concept in the same article of the white listener, right? Because when we say that someone's English is good or bad, it's not really about what they're saying. It's about how it might be perceived and by whom, right? So for example, monolingualism, right, using one language, and these stark language boundaries, like this is English, this is Spanish, right? These have been normed in recent decades, and therefore racialized people who use unstandardized forms of English and other tools of language are not seen as creative or gifted, but they're seen as inferior because they don't use the standardized language the way that they're supposed to, right? And because the white listener will have trouble understanding them, they're seen as deficient. So in my current work, I argue that this denigration of unmistakable innovation is tied to the way the racialized have been infantilized and seen as disabled over several hundred years, going all the way back to slavery, colonialism, etc. There's a lot about that, but I'm not going to go into that. But the point is, we're seen, racialized people are seen as lacking in intelligence, lacking in ability, lacking in all of the things that white folks have. And therefore, we can't be seen as clever or innovative, whereas a white individual, right, a multilingual white individual is celebrated for their intelligence. They're seen as a polyglot, right? Whereas we are seen as lacking in language, even if we're able to produce the same forms. I don't know if all of you are not in the United States, but there's the Secretary of Transportation in the United States, his name is Pete Buttigieg. And when he was running for president before the most recent election, it turned out that he spoke 5 or 6 languages, including Norwegian, right? There was no particular reason for him to speak Norwegian. He was just interested in it. And he was seen as so smart. He was so smart, right? But if you are a person from Mexico and you speak Mexican, you speak an indigenous language, and you speak some English, because you aren't speaking a certain way, because of your identity, you are still seen as lesser, even if you speak 3, 4, 5 languages. So these racial linguistic ideologies help us understand how language is perceived according to a person's categorization. It's just very difficult to get out of these understandings. So this sort of languagelessness which is also coined by Rosa, which pervades both external and internal perceptions of the racialized. And these perceptions are continuously reified by institutions, assessments, and powerful cultural norms. As Rosa explained, through standardizing institutions, people are socialized to racial linguistic ideologies about more and less legitimate language practices. So basically, people are socialized to believe in what is a legitimate way of using language and what's not a legitimate way of using language. And those things that are considered legitimate or not legitimate are based on the identities of the people who use the language. So think about some student evaluations. This is another story. So these ideologies had a concrete impact on my own program, the program I mentioned before, far beyond the nebulous nature of them saying they were bad at English. Like, this had a real impact on their lives. So in assessing a student's progress, we were obligated to rely on a particular oral exam that provided us with the yearly grant, a financial grant that supported our program. It also paid my salary, so I had to do it, right? Any of these monies are going to come with strings attached. And the biggest string was this oral exam that every student had to take at the start and the end of each quarter. Now, part of the reason I was even hired for this job is because at a previous job, my employers had funded our certification in this examination. And so when they advertised for this job, they said, "Are you this test certified?" And I was, so it helped me get the job. So this test is widespread, or at least it was 8 years ago. It's popular and it's trusted. And the data that emerges is seen as reliable and valid, which I don't know if you're doctoral students or undergrads or whatever, but like, that's the gold standard when it comes to data, right? And it's also, I want to be clear, completely tied to these racial linguistic ideologies. It keeps all of these things in place. So the test is a series of questions, starting off with basic, what's your name? And becoming more complex. And they're posed to students in one-on-one interviews. These interviews are mandated to be conducted at a specific 90-degree angle. I don't know why, but that's what the test company said, and we had to do it. The students were supposed to answer the question, and we were supposed to rate their responses across 3 variables: how well they understood what we asked, how complex their answers were, and how well we understood their responses. I hope you can see how there might be some issues with this. But anyway, the test company gave us very specific instructions, even more specific than the angle we were supposed to sit. For example, some of the questions only required a yes or no answer as a response to be answered correctly. I mean, I had one question that said, "Did you walk to school today?" Right? Either you did or you didn't. The answer is yes or no. But we were told that if someone answered with a yes or no answer, that was supposed to be marked on the lowest score for complexity, right? Even if that was the right answer, that was supposed to be marked as the lowest score for complexity. So the first several dozen times I administered the test, I followed the rules. And so I marked the completely perfectly grammatical sentence of no as insufficiently complex, but it started to bother me, so I stopped doing what I was supposed to do. Yeah, I just stopped doing the job. Similarly, because I had spent so many years teaching English, I understood pretty much everything these people said to me, no matter what their quote-unquote accent might have been. This means that I was rating people very highly on how well I understood them. But then I had conversations with my white colleagues, and I was told that students, such as the ones I mentioned in this presentation, who were considering that they were bad at English, I was told that my colleagues didn't understand what they said. And, you know, it didn't really matter. I was the one giving the tests. But I realized that what was happening is that these students were always going to be seen as bad at English through this evaluation, and as long as the white listener is really the one judging how good their English is. So what was particularly insidious about this, though, is that the fact that if I hadn't started ignoring the rules, I would have continued to provide evidence for their belief that their English was bad, and it would have been codified into official government data. So, you know, these were free community classes, so they were unlikely to prevent them from any sort of school or employment, but there's a database somewhere that these students, who any of you would understand just fine, are indeed bad at English because they spoke in a way that the unnamed and unmentioned white listener might have had to work slightly harder to process. So what it just means is that all this test is proving viability to the white listener. What these racial-linguistic ideologies do is place an immense burden on the racialized to provide their viability as communicators and indeed their value as human beings. And unless and until we confront these ways of thinking, then we'll still be telling their students are lacking. What's more, the students tended to improve on the tests at the end of the quarter, not because of what they learned in class, but because they were more comfortable with the person giving the exam, me. And they actually tended to speak in longer, more complex sentences the second time I gave it to them. The test company said this wasn't supposed to happen. You're supposed to take the test from a stranger every time because they wanted you uncomfortable, right? And of course, this prevented people from speaking as freely or as comfortably as they otherwise might. And these people whose English was not bad at all were always uncomfortable and not speaking as clearly as they otherwise would have. In other words, everything about the exam was designed in such a way that it underlined the inherently minoritized nature of these students' English. These evaluations are designed to ensure linguistic deficiency. But I want to make a point that as harmful as this is to what we might know as non-native speakers, this is not good for native speakers either. So basically, quote-unquote native speakers, and it's not a concept that I really believe in, but even the people who are seen as native speakers, like born in the United States, born in Canada, whatever, the racialization still impacts the way they're seen. I'm Black, and the way that I speak is going to be seen a certain way because of that, even though I was born in the United States. So the construction of so-called standard English not only excludes other named languages, right, where if you speak Spanish or you speak Portuguese or something like that, you're seen as different, but it also classifies different versions of English as inferior if they're associated with racialized people. So if you are Indian, for example, and you speak English and you got everything quote-unquote right on the test, but because you're Indian, that version of English is seen as lesser. Right? They want you to speak British or American English, right? Let's consider the conundrum of being seen as both Black and quote-unquote articulate, right? This is a label that has been applied to me more than once. It feels like a compliment and it's meant as such, but the positive intentions cannot disguise the fact that the comment positions being Black and being articulate as being opposites of one another. So when This is a quote: "When whites use the word in reference to black, it often carries a subtext of amazement, of bewilderment. It's like praising a female executive or a politician by calling her tough or a rational decision maker. Even if this were taken as a compliment, it is an insult to black languaging, which is seen as inherently inarticulate and deficient because of the way that blackness itself is viewed." So basically, the way that the people that person is the member of the group of are perceived is the way that their languaging will be perceived. And there's not that much to be done about it until we get rid of these hierarchies. This quote here, "articulate and clean," was said about the former President Barack Obama when he was rising into politics. And it was said by the current president, Joe Biden, when he was talking about how he came onto the scene. So, that's fun. Anyway, when I refer to black languaging, I'm referring to what we call in the United States, and it's different in different places, African American vernacular English, African American English, or African American language. I don't really care what you call it, but the point is, it's taken decades to get this seen as equal, seen as legitimate, to standardize English, and it's still not seen that way by a lot of people. In fact, when I type African American language into Google, I get slang as one of my top suggestions. So, when research is about the way many of us communicate, it's still written at a slight remove from how we make our meaning. Black languaging, the way that Black people use language and the way that we communicate with each other, and this is true for all racialized groups, but I'm speaking from my perspective, is seen as illegitimate, inarticulate, unintelligent, and lacking in capacity. And this is not born of just some discomfort with linguistic accuracy. It's because of discomfort with Blackness. And when you think about any racialized group, right, whether you're talking about East Asians, when you're talking about Latinx people, right, and I know Latinx isn't necessarily a race, but you know what I mean, the way that that group is perceived and the way that the group is perceived as other is going to be the way that they use the language is perceived. I keep repeating myself, sorry. So I always struggle somewhat in talking about this topic because here I am. I'm using mostly standardized American English, and therefore I'm reifying this discrepancy between the perceived legitimacy of African American language and the language that whiteness would prefer to consume. African American language has an entirely complex set of rules for pronunciation and grammar, and the people who use it more frequently than I do, while still navigating a society tied to standardized English, are capable of linguistic feats that I am not capable of, despite their being seen as less intelligent by those who tie language to ability. So, Black students, for example, can be in the habit of tapping into these linguistic repertoires, while still being seen as incorrect by their own teachers. I always spoke this way when I was at school, and whatever my teachers thought of me, they never had occasion to use my language to discredit me. In other words, I was always articulate. But if I'm going to be seen as articulate, what with my own educational background and the class privilege I have, and too many letters after my name, then I might as well use what I know about communicating in a way that whiteness finds comfortable to take aim at the ideologies that support it. So, there is nothing wrong with your English, viewers. No matter how you employ the language, it is viable and legitimate. No matter what your tests and your professors believe, your English is legitimate. I hope you understand a bit better now how the way you're corrected and guided might be tied to perceptions of your identity, and I hope you refuse to believe ever again that you are bad at English.
I'll report back the audience reactions to Justin and to the guys, because it would have been nice for him to hear that as well. So, okay, so now, great, I'm on time actually, which is amazing. Right, okay, so we have got time to discuss, and this is the first bit of, or the first round of discussions that I want to do. I want to talk about this specific talk. And I want you to think, what are the benefits of using this text, what I mean is lecture, using this lecture on a pre-sessional course, or you can think about your own context, and you don't have to do it on a pre-sessional. Are there any potential considerations or drawbacks to using this talk? And why do you think the talk elicited polarised reactions from the teachers? Yes, this is just some of the things that I felt after the experience. I think that, you know, decolonising the curriculum EDI is okay in theory, but not necessarily in practice, as lots of other people also say. That's just one example. I think I was a bit naive, and I should have prepared students. I think the students were fine. I think as the tutors, I should have prepared better. I want to involve students more in topic selection, but I also think that we are positioned as, you know, the gatekeepers of the global language of academia, whether we like it or not. That is the reality, and I think that we have a responsibility to examine colonial histories in EAP. That's just my opinion, and I also think that in the current context in the UK, I think it's probably the same in America as well. The government are trying to limit discussion of social justice topics in education, and that can discriminate against minoritized groups. And, you know, even like their policies about language, there was a talk about from Liz about the Office for Students and their language policies that they're trying to influence universities. Again, you know, they can be discriminatory. So I think that we should be speaking up. So maybe you can take a photo of this. I don't think there's time to read this now, but this was something that I did in response to introducing that lecture. This is now in the tutor handbook. The tutors read this. I think we should probably discuss this as well, but this kind of gives a justification for the kind of topics that I choose in the lecture series, not my lecture series, in the lecture series for the pre-sessional. And yeah, so the teachers get to read that, and I think probably I should share it with the students as well.